This morning's briefing, to start off, I'm going to begin a discussion on United States legislation that's come up over the past few years now. It's also appropriate for this venue here outside of the United States, because looking at the list of attendees here, I think virtually everybody in the audience does a pretty good share of business for the U.S. defense market. So though the legislation and regulations particularly apply to U.S.-based companies, there's an expectation to pass a significant amount of these requirements on to suppliers, including folks in this room. So you'll definitely be impacted by them. These statutes were initiated as a result of the Senate Armed Services Committee investigation to its through the Armed Services Committee back starting in late 2010, an investigation inquiry through a number of contractors and lower level suppliers to get a handle on the incidence of counterfeits and to make some observations about how they were handled, to try and get a sense of behaviors throughout the supply chain as to how they're addressed, and then to determine from that whether or not some legislative and regulatory actions are needed to deal with that. And in short of that, there were a number of concerns that came out of that investigation, which which are driving changes to regulations as we speak right now, and first manifested themselves in the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2012, Section 818 specifically. My personal observation is in comparison to other legislation that's been put forward to deal with counterfeit parts issues. This is probably some of the most intelligent legislation that I've seen in terms of the breadth of it and understanding of nuances, though there are a number of elements that need to be addressed in order to adequately address the concerns. As you see here, it operates from several fronts, not only from purchasing practices, depending on who you buy from, inspection and testing to avoid issues, reporting and quarantining to avoid returning known bad parts back to the supply chain, corrective measures in terms of dealing with suppliers who repeat bad performers. Major element was cost remediation. If a counterfeit finds its way into a piece of Defense Department gear, costs are not to be passed on to the taxpayer. And also some enforcement leverage too, from the standpoint of beyond the breadth of what the Department of Defense can do, also further enabling the investigative and Customs and Border Protection personnel in order to do what they can to avoid bringing products into the country. The core of Section 818 is really three really basic things. It's emphasize buying material from the original producers or their authorized dealers is probably the surest bet of avoiding counterfeits, and all the data is continuing to show us that. However, in circumstances, and the legislation recognizes that there are circumstances where that's not going to be possible because of obsolescence or other issues, predominantly obsolescence. And when you need to buy from sources other than that, what really needs to be dealt with in terms of inspection and testing beyond what companies typically do, but specifically to avoid counterfeits. And also, when counterfeits are found to communicate those findings, because that information is also key to pass on, because very rarely does a company use a part and they're the only ones who use it. Other folks use the same product. The demand wasn't stimulated by that particular company that bought that product, so it's important for others to be aware of that as well. Now, there's regulatory activity going on right now as we speak in order to implement this. In terms of the strengths here, it does call for the Department of Defense to take a risk-based approach, meaning not a one-size-fits-all, but take a look at the risk of penetration and the impact on applications. It does place an emphasis on on where you buy your material from, on distinguishing more trustworthy suppliers than those that are perhaps riskier, adoption of internal systems and establishing as a part of standard business practices, an awareness of counterfeiting and the protocols you need in order to avoid them, reporting of incidents. Also, a key element is that the expectation is there are elements of this that not only apply to contractors, but also to the Department of Defense itself in terms of how it buys material directly, and also to strengthen Customs Border Patrol authority to address this. That said, there are a number of issues and unknowns that are still in play, even with some of the regulations that are being kicked around at this point. Is that on one hand, even though the legislation calls for a risk-based approach, it really treats events associated with a counterfeit all equally, regardless of the type of counterfeit or its particular impact. It's really one, all counterfeits are bad and the consequences are equal, pretty much, which is an encumbrance in many respects, and also lacks clarity and definition in terms of costs that a contractor can pass on associated with anti-counterfeiting activities versus costs of events, and there's a number of gray areas that need to be sorted out. Major concern is the focus is really put squarely on the foreheads of prime and second, third tier contractors. And prime and second, third tier contractors are generally not how counterfeits find their way into the supply chain in the first place, and doesn't really provide the reach down into the parts of the market that, where they tend to be introduced. So that's another major concern. And also, though there is a distinction in terms of what a trusted supplier should be, it really lacks clarity in that respect. There have been long-standing issues in terms of disposition. When you find counterfeits, we understand, okay, we shouldn't turn them back because they'll probably find their way back into the food chain again. But what do we do with them? If we destroy them right away, are we encumbering the opportunity for a criminal investigation? And if we are supposed to hold on to them, how long? I mean, there's our cases, if, for example, in the company I report to, where we have counterfeits that we've held on for over a decade now. Investigators have come by to get some, but not others, and we're still kind of wondering what it is that we're supposed to do with these at this point. Though there was a lot of criticism in terms of certain things that the original component manufacturers could do to help, at least as a part of the Senate Armed Services Committee's observations. The legislation is silent on that, and also if you've seen some of the studies in terms of how specific considerations and problems in the defense and aerospace community, it's really silent on dealing with obsolescence issues. And as long as obsolete parts are not dealt with in designs, and there's with even less money nowadays, less opportunity to do that, that in and of itself introduces a risk, and it's not really dealt with. Subsequent to the 2012 NDAA, in the following year there was a carve-out which does give some narrow safe harbor to contractors with respect to remediation costs if they had a government-approved system, and if they acquired that product from the government, and if they provided prompt notification. So a little bit of a carve-out, but nothing to get really too excited about, but that's another piece of legislation. Now, as a result of the legislative activity, the rulemaking in terms of crafting up proposed rules and how this is going to be executed have started to flow. This particular Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement proposed rule specifically on counterfeit detection and avoidance is intended to cover most of the elements of what was in the initial legislation. As it calls for, it talks to definition of what's considered counterfeit, defines contractors' responsibilities, and says there's some attempt to clarify the government's role, though in my personal observation it doesn't really do much to clarify that. However, the proposed rule that's out there, it's still in play, doesn't address a number of important issues in terms of dealing with this. Again, it's imbalanced in terms of the approach of dealing with counterfeit prevention. Again, place it fully square on the heads of primes and upper tier contractors and doesn't reach down at the elements of the supply chain where it should. And I'm sure there are a number of folks in the room here who have dealt with upper tier contractors who are flowing down requirements and issues that you may be having in terms of some of the requirements you're seeing. And again, that's really a reaction to this imbalance issue. Also, there's an expectation that a contractor will establish a counterfeit electronic part avoidance and detection system, meaning a set of business practices embedded as a part of their business operations to deal with this issue. There's a list of elements, but there's no criteria for what those elements mean, and some of them, a number of us who have been at this for a while are struggling with what there was really meant by some of these elements, and there's no criteria from which to assess contractors. There's a problematic definition of counterfeit. The definition that was proposed in the view of many drags in a number of categories of other nonconformances and does little more than just put more smoke over the issue and doesn't really do much to help. Despite the fact that the legislation called for a trusted supplier approach in terms of distinguishing who's a safer supplier and who is not as safe a supplier and what you do to deal with that, the proposed rule is really silent in that regard and doesn't do any distinction whatsoever. Again, doesn't deal with obsolescence issues, and also in the case of commercial off-the-shelf items, I'll talk about, say, a Dell computer or something I would otherwise go buy from Best Buy. The commercial marketplace is generally not very open to accepting flow-down requirements in terms of where you buy your parts from and risk avoidance elements, and it doesn't really address that issue at all. And I have a couple of references here that gets in a little more detail on those elements. Two other rules that are being worked on and they haven't been released for public comment are on these two. One is on reporting, which is if you find a counterfeit, or we're speculating now that because of the title it's going to go beyond just counterfeiting, is what's the expectation of reporting cases where you find a non-conforming part and how that process goes, the breadth of it. So that's another one to keep an eye out on, and I would fully expect that as more gets unfolded in that particular area, you're going to find cases where an upper tier contractor will have an expectation of you if you're associated with a counterfeit escape, and an expectation with respect to reporting, not just to them, but to also through the government industry data exchange program. It's a likely scenario. There's also another rule in play with respect to laying in a quality clause expectation. We haven't seen what that one's like yet, but that'll be another one to keep an eye on to see what the expectation is going to be. Again, we've got insight as to what the first rule says. It was put out for public comment late spring. Not much feedback yet as far as what the government's going to be doing with that, and we haven't seen the other two rules yet. So this will continue to evolve over time. So now we've got some general information on where to expect things to go that can probably help in terms of what does one's compliance program for dealing with counterfeit parts look like, and what are some things to keep in mind in that regard. And I'll walk through some thoughts on that. I'll refer back again to the proposed rule that's out on the street now to look at. If you look on the right-hand side of this slide, this includes what we're commonly known on, at least amongst us upper tier U.S. defense contractors, as the 9 elements of the DFAR. And again, these are fundamentally the same 9 elements that are in the proposed rule that was put out that was approved at the beginning of the 2012 calendar year. The key expectations here is the contractors are going to establish formal business systems to address the issue. If they don't do that, they may find that their purchasing system may not be approved, and that's a big deal. Typically, larger contractors go through what's called a contractor purchasing system review with government auditors who do a periodic evaluation just to make sure contractors' business processes are in place, and this is being embedded into that. And if it is absent of dealing with these key elements, the contractor system may be disapproved. And also and it remains to be seen to what extent a misstep even even after the government may approve it, how much of a misstep may drive the continued approval of a system. So the fact that they're tying this into CPSR is really a big deal. Again, the major concern here is that there is nothing in the rule yet, and we haven't seen anything from the U.S. government yet to really elaborate on what these 9 really mean, each of them, and what's the expectation, what's the criteria that's going to be used for assessment. And I'll tell you that once we upper tier contractors get a handle on what that is, you're going to be hearing from us, because that expectation is going to be passed down. So that'll be something to watch. Now, we'll talk about the importance of standards. Again, at this particular conference, this is particularly pertinent, is that the U.S. Department of Defense tends to shy away from writing its own specifications and standards for what it believes should be industry standard processes, and in order to take advantage of smart industry practices that are conducive to doing DoD business in an effective way. It's a much more cost-effective way to go, and it's an oversimplified description of what that's about. So in this particular area, though we haven't seen anything documenting an expectation, we hear a lot from key players in the Department of Defense working on policy and regulatory activity that there is going to be a continued dependency on standards. And a number of U.S. government from several agencies, but also the Department of Defense representatives, are on a number of the G19 committees and subcommittees that are working on this standards. And as a matter of fact, the 3 particular standards have actually been adopted by DoD, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But this particular chart is just intended to illustrate, more or less to show a gap analysis from the standpoint of to what extent existing standards that are out there address what are generally considered the key tenements of a counterfeit avoidance and detection system, depending on where you are in the supply chain, whether you're a system integrator or all the way down to a component supplier. And these are the 5 predominant documents that have been issued by SAE through the G19 and its subcommittees over the past almost 7 years now, right, Phil? Started in October of 2004. 3 of these, as I mentioned, have been adopted by the Department of Defense. Now, this is a point of confusion. I'll only bring it up that may actually conjure further confusion, but in essence, the way it was put to us is by the Defense Standardization Program Office, and these are the folks who are in front of the standardization programs for the Department of Defense, is when DoD adopts the standards, it's more or less a good housekeeping seal of approval. Now, it doesn't mean that it is going to be enforcing use, but you can think of it as a means that, okay, the standards officials for various departments within the Department of Defense have reviewed certain standards, have said, yes, this will satisfy DoD's needs if we expect this of our suppliers. And they have done so with 3 standards. One which was AS 5553, the original document that was first issued back in April of 2009 and was adopted very shortly afterward. Not long after AS 6081, which is an AS 5553 intended for distribution suppliers of components, was adopted last June, as was AS 6174 on material. Again, we haven't seen anything specific yet from DoD in terms of how they plan to instantiate this adoption, but we can certainly see that these and others will follow as far as the documents that DoD are going to depend on. There's a new group that is starting to be set up within the SAE fold now, made up of prime and upper tier contractors to kind of take a look at the full landscape of standardization activity in the anti-counterfeiting area to determine how well it best, how well the full complement of standards and other implementations support what a prime and upper tier contractor needs to have in place and expect of its suppliers. And what you see here is, over on the left-hand side, you'll see what the proposed Defense Department rule on counterfeit avoidance detection is going to call for, with the 9 elements there, and to what extent does, say, AS 5553 support and can be used to articulate expectations for those requirements. And the answer in general from this group was, Yes, this is definitely suitable for that, and we would encourage the government to do that. As a matter of fact, the Council of Defense and Space Industry Associations, which is made up of an assortment of U.S.-based industry associations supporting the aerospace and defense industry, as a group have recommended to the government that they use AS 5553 as the benchmark for expectation and to base its criteria and implementation on that. Some areas for standards bodies to consider, particularly SAE at this juncture, having taken the lead in this area, though a tremendous amount has been accomplished over the past 6-7 years. There are a number of gaps that still remain. I chuckle a little bit at this first one, because even at this day and age, we are still churning over key definitions. We started this activity back in 2007, and with every committee that is stood up and every new major move by the government that comes up, there is a desire to go look at that definition again and again and again. So more work needs to be done in order to sort that out, particularly in the face of what the Defense Department is going to expect and the regulatory expectations. The government had introduced the term legally authorized source in terms of tying into a trusted supplier type of scenario. That needs to be, would suggest that that be further embedded in the standards activity, as well as more clarity on what a trusted supplier is. I mean, AS 5553 is very good at describing the safest versus the riskier suppliers and what to do depending on where you are in that space, but doesn't do a clear distinction to very clearly couple with what the legislation called for. The term counterfeit electronic part avoidance and detection system, that's a new lingo now with the proposed regulation that is calling for business systems to embed this process. It would be a great benefit to the community to flesh out the definition of those system elements and to also develop supportive criteria. The Defense Contract Management Authority, the quality assurance groups have typically been delegated to go off and poke at contractors to see how they're doing at this, and have done some assessments over the past year, and they've used AS 5553 for that. But more needs to be laid in order to establish more specific criteria. Once we get a handle on what the reporting expectation is with respect to counterfeiting and non-conforming supplies, there's going to be more work that's going to need to be done on that. There is some work going on amongst the G19 committees now, but fundamentally they're guessing on what to expect, but don't really know what that rule is going to say yet. And once we get a handle on what's going to be communicated there, there would be important for standards activity to work that issue as well. Risk assessment elements in terms of more quantified risk assessment approach. You'll be hearing more about that at noon. That's a part of the keynote speech I'll be doing. How to deal with commercial off-the-shelf item assemblies is a big deal and really hasn't been clearly dealt with. And there's still a lot of confusion on that. I mean, if you're not a part of the G19 fold and you're someone working with that standard, it's not very clear. And even on the U.S. government customer end. One thing that we had noticed, we had recommended very early on after 5553 was put out was, gee, it would be nice to wire that into expectations for quality management systems. It would be nice if AS 9100 and AS 9120 or other QMS standard certifications laid in an expectation that, hey, this is a part of the fold of things you have to go to, and that's still not there yet. I mean, work is now just starting to consider doing that, and it's already been 6 years now. It's going to take another half decade before we see that, but more work needs to go in that area. One thing that is not on this list, but was something that came to mind after a recent event is there probably should be some discussion and consideration for looking at what place should standards play with respect to various taggant technologies to either associate a provenance or authenticity to product. Still a bit of smoke over that, and based on some recent events with an issue that occurred out of a U.S. Defense Department agency, kind of brings up a number of questions about from the standpoint of the end user who is calling for that requirement for provenance or for authentication, the technology service and their expectations from a business standpoint with the marking providers, and taking into account the various scenarios that are there in terms of who are the players in the process of buying material that may be marked between, for example, the government end user. They're buying from a component supplier who is sending parts out to one lab for some set of tests, who's sending them off to another lab to finish up a certain point of tests. What's the appropriate point in which to apply a provenance mark or an authentication mark, if that's what that means? And how does it take into account the back-end scenarios from the standpoint of later on, even those parts are going to find their way out in the food chain again? And how is it that others are going to have visibility into, when I see this mark, what is it really telling me? Is it telling me authenticity, or is it telling me provenance? And when it's telling me one or the other, what are the things that came along with it? Because just having the mark there doesn't necessarily do it, and having that information available is going to be key. So that'll be another element that I would invite the SAE and G19 committees to consider looking at as the next steps as we go forward.